What would have happened if petroleum had already been there before it was even discovered? Was that black liquid slowly seeping from the depths of the earth an ordinary natural occurrence, or a hidden blessing offered to humanity? Long before Colonel Edwin Drake drilled the first well in western Pennsylvania, this substance was seeping underground into Oil Creek. Its name stretched back to the 18th century, and the surface of the water was covered with an oily film shimmering with rainbow hues. This slippery fluid was so widespread that it contaminated drinking wells and practically punished the entrepreneurs drilling in the region in search of salt. The Seneca and Corn Planter Indians had already recognized its value even then. They made ointments, used it for medicinal purposes, and even drew upon this substance to paint their faces before battle. To collect the oil accumulating on the surface of the stream, they would spread blankets or flannel cloths over the water, and when the fabric was saturated with oil, they would wring it out to extract the liquid. Long before Drake's drilling, Seneca oil had won renown as a powerful remedy for many ailments, ranging from joint stiffness to headaches. By the 1850s, Samuel Keir began collecting the petroleum that appeared unwanted in his father's salt wells. He filled this liquid into small half-liter bottles and brought it to market under the name Keir's Rock Oil. With a slight charlatan's air, he claimed this mixture was a cure for nearly every ailment. He said it could heal liver problems, bronchitis, even tuberculosis, and his claims were not limited to these. One cannot help but ask, could Dr. Rockefeller have sold Keir's Rock Oil from the back of his wagon? By the 1850s, whale hunting had become unable to meet the rapidly growing demand for illuminating oil. As supply fell short, the price of whale oil rose, and illuminating the home in the evenings became a luxury for ordinary Americans. Only the wealthy could now fill their parlor with light every night. Of course there were alternatives: lard, tallow, cottonseed oil, coal oil derived from shale, and wicks soaked in fat. However, none of these offered a solution that burned both brightly and cleanly and safely and cheaply as well. Cities were growing, factories multiplying. As urbanization and industrialization advanced together, the need for a light source to carry the day into the night became ever more apparent. This search promised to break the rural time order that still governed the lives of farmers and city dwellers alike, to push back the boundaries of night. The birth of the petroleum industry emerged from a thoroughly modern combination of commercial intuition and scientific creativity. In the 1850s, when he was still in his early 30s, Dartmouth College graduate George Bissell was living a remarkable life. He had worked as a journalist, taken on professorship in Greek, and served as a school principal and lawyer. What set him apart in the midst of all this turbulent career was a powerful intuition. He believed that rock oil, abundant in western Pennsylvania, could provide a far superior illuminating product than coal oil. To give form to this idea, he founded the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. He leased land along Oil Creek on a tributary of the Allegheny River. He then sent a petroleum sample taken from the region to Professor Benjamin Silliman, Jr. of Yale University, one of the most respected chemists of the era, to be analyzed. In his landmark report published in 1855, Silliman confirmed Bissell's foresight. When this oil was distilled, not only a superior illuminant, but also many different and valuable byproducts could be obtained. However, the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company faced one single but enormous problem. In order to convert Silliman's scientific findings into real revenue, large quantities of crude petroleum had to be found. The company's structure changed over time, and its name soon became the Seneca Oil Company. But it took nearly 3 years for them to send someone into the field to search for commercially scaled petroleum deposits in Pennsylvania. Finally, one of the investors in the project, New Haven banker Townsend, assigned a man named Edwin Drake, who was boarding at his inn. Drake set out for Titusville in December 1857. Edwin Drake, who had worked as a conductor on the New Haven Railroad, was 38 years old when he arrived in Titusville, a widower struggling with health problems. He was disabled by spinal neuralgia. He had a serious, measured, and gentle personality. Photographs from the period show him as a striking figure with a full beard, a broad forehead, and bright eyes with heavy lids. His investment in the project was at a symbolic level. Despite this, in order to inspire confidence among the local population and make the venture appear more impressive, he was given a grandiose title like president. He also began to be referred to with the honorary title of colonel, and entered the pages of history by this name. When Drake arrived in Titusville, the Oil Creek Valley was still a pastoral region covered with dense pine and fir forests, rich in game animals. Drake, pale-faced in his top hat and dark black clothing, created an almost painting-like contrast in the middle of this semi-wild landscape. The traces of petroleum gleaming on the surface of the stream were promising, but without solid geological knowledge of underground petroleum formations, attempting to find a significant reserve turned into a patience-consuming process. As the search dragged on, both time and money were lost. The local population saw Drake as someone sympathetic, sociable, and with stories to tell. But these same people watched his petroleum obsession with a somewhat mocking eye. Most viewed him as an adventurer living in a world of dreams. In the first excavation attempts, the walls of the well collapsed, and the venture failed. Drake then decided to drill directly, adapting a method used in salt wells. Setting up the necessary equipment on the difficult brush-covered terrain was a struggle in itself. Even constructing the long wooden tower called a derrick was considered a significant accomplishment. Finally, on Sunday, August 28, 1859, when petroleum rose from the well drilled the day before, months of persistence and stubbornness bore fruit. Drake's madness had now become a concrete reality. What Drake accomplished was not so much revealing the existence of petroleum as showing how this already known resource could be accessed in a controlled manner at commercial scale. The real innovation was proving that petroleum could be pumped regularly from underground. This success unleashed something like a frenzy in the region. Crowds chasing fortune flocked to Titusville and the surrounding peaceful rural area. Speculators rushed to snap up the oil-stained slopes along the creek. They made leases from landowners, most of whom were illiterate and inexperienced. One farmer had even stubbornly insisted on a 1/8 share, refusing the quarter share offered to him. Before long, derricks began rising in every corner of the valley. The slopes, once lush green, were split by drillings. The narrow and dark valley transformed into an entirely different landscape with rapidly multiplying towers and drilled wells. Drilling was only the beginning. Petroleum's journey was the first link in a long chain of production. Within a year of Drake's success, more than a dozen primitive refineries were established on the steep and desolate banks of the creek. This activity quickly caught Cleveland's attention. The city's proximity to northwestern Pennsylvania gave it a significant advantage. Despite the slow transportation conditions of the era, it was possible to travel from Titusville to Cleveland within a day. Moreover, some entrepreneurs in Cleveland were already producing illuminating oil from bituminous coal. Therefore, it was not to be expected that they would remain indifferent to a new and potentially more efficient source. On November 18, 1859, approximately 3 months after Drake's well, the Cleveland Leader newspaper brought the activity around Titusville to its pages. The report stated that the petroleum fields in northern Pennsylvania were attracting intense speculation, and expressed that a genuine rush toward the oil-bearing lands was underway. One of the first Clevelanders to go to Titusville was commodities trader James G. Hussey. He was also the former employer of Rockefeller's partner Maurice B. Clark. On returning from the region, he impressed those around him with excited accounts of the fortunes to be made. We do not know what Rockefeller thought about this development at the time of Drake's discovery. However, years later, after he had earned his unparalleled fortune from petroleum, John D. Rockefeller would express that he saw a divine plan in the Pennsylvania petroleum discovery. In his view, these enormous reserves of wealth were a gift from the great and generous Creator. Rockefeller also particularly emphasized that he felt gratitude for the fact that Colonel Drake, the Standard Oil Company, and all others connected with this industry, had the opportunity to prepare and distribute this precious product to meet the needs of the world. As we shall see in subsequent chapters, Rockefeller always approached the petroleum industry with an almost sacred perspective. This approach did not remain in words alone. He reinforced it with his material support as well. He believed that God had offered kerosene to suffering humanity as a blessing. This belief established an unshakable confidence in the industry's future, and enabled him to continue on his path at moments when others hesitated and pulled back. Nevertheless, despite all the religious enthusiasm he later displayed, John D. Rockefeller had not grasped petroleum's potential through a sudden flash of enlightenment. His shift from production to petroleum did not happen suddenly, but occurred step by step. Clark and Rockefeller may have taken some of the first crude petroleum shipments reaching Cleveland in the early 1860s on consignment. However, the truly decisive element was the friendship between Morris Clark and the Englishman Samuel Andrews, who was from Clark's hometown in Wiltshire. This relationship was influential in drawing Rockefeller more deeply into this business. Andrews, broad-faced, warm-blooded, and always appearing cheerful, was a rosy-cheeked Englishman. He was a self-taught chemist, a mechanical craftsman of entrepreneurial spirit with an innate talent for repair. When he came to Cleveland in the 1850s, he began working in a tallow refinery operated by his compatriot, C.A. Dean. Here he gained substantial experience in the production of tallow, candles, and coal oil. In 1860, Dean procured a 10-barrel shipment of crude petroleum from Pennsylvania. Andrews processed this petroleum and distilled the first petroleum-based kerosene produced in Cleveland. The method of refining petroleum with sulfuric acid, the process we today call refining, was viewed at the time as a great secret. This knowledge was guarded by local practical chemists almost like the mysteries of a priestly class. However, curious business people who had caught the scent of commercial opportunity set off in pursuit of this secret, and before long began gathering at Andrews' door. Filled with admiration for the extraordinary properties of kerosene, Andrews believed wholeheartedly that this product would surpass all other illuminating sources and take over the market. However, the financial situation at home was tight. As income fell short, his wife was taking in sewing work to contribute to the budget. Despite this, by 1862, Sam was determined to leave Dean and establish his own business. His search for capital took him frequently to the office of Clark and Rockefeller. Rockefeller knew Andrews and his wife from the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church. Religious ties were once again opening a door to a worldly opportunity. When Andrews began excitedly describing the petroleum refinery idea, Clark cut him off with a cautious manner. He told him plainly that the money he and John could spare from their business did not exceed $250. The credit they received from banks barely sufficed to give advances on consigned goods, pay insurance, and rent. There was no capacity for more. Not finding the support he had expected from Clark, Andrews did not give up. He went directly to Rockefeller's office and continued describing his idea with the same enthusiasm. Rockefeller, who had by then accumulated enough capital to invest in his first railroad shares, appeared more open to new opportunities and had resources to spend on this venture. Following his meeting with Rockefeller, Andrews returned to the warehouse and set about persuading Clark once more. Clark would later recall that moment as follows: "I was trying to get him to be quiet, but when he said Mr. Rockefeller finds this business suitable, I immediately said, if John is in, so am I." In his later accounts, Rockefeller preferred to show his own role as more of a background one. He suggested that he had initially approached the petroleum venture with skepticism, and that Morris Clark's brothers James and Richard were in fact the enthusiastic party. In his view, it was as a result of the combined insistence of the three Clark brothers and Sam Andrews that he had stepped into this refinery business. However the details of events may have unfolded, the end result was that Rockefeller and Morris Clark agreed to cover half of the operating capital of the newly established Andrews, Clark and Company refinery. They committed $4,000 for this share. Thus, the 24-year-old Rockefeller had formally entered the petroleum sector in 1863, in the critical year when the Emancipation Proclamation was declared and the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg took place. Looking back later on that first $4,000 investment, he would say, "It had seemed very large to us, truly very large." In those days they did not imagine that petroleum would surpass their main commercial activities. They viewed this venture as a small supplementary activity, carried out on the side while they continued their brokerage business. Located far from the petroleum fields, in Cleveland's important commercial center, the natural path of entry into the sector for Rockefeller was refining. He took his place not at the wells, but at the processing stage. Rockefeller belonged to a different type of businessman represented by the new industrial order, in which the distance between those who produced raw materials in the countryside and the consumers in the cities was growing ever wider. He was part of this intermediary generation that bought, sold, processed, and distributed products rather than producing them directly. The location chosen for the new refinery clearly reflected his business philosophy, if on a small scale. He exercised an option on a 3-acre plot located on the steep red clay banks of a narrow waterway called Kingsbury Run. This waterway connected to the Cuyahoga River, which in turn provided access to Lake Erie. The facility, situated approximately 1.5 miles from downtown Cleveland, was established under the name Excelsior Works. At first glance it gave a somewhat ominous impression as a location. In this semi-rural area beyond the city limits, cows grazed peacefully and trees still cast shadows over the waterway. Even though the chosen location appeared unfavorable at first glance, what truly mattered for Rockefeller was that the area would soon become adjacent to new railroad lines. Indeed, on November 3, 1863, the bright locomotive of the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad, decorated with Union flags, entered the station in Cleveland and inaugurated a new era for the city. Through this line, Cleveland was directly connected both to New York via the Erie Railroad and to the petroleum fields in Pennsylvania. The ability to transport via both waterway and railroad gave Rockefeller a great advantage. He had thus acquired the bargaining power he needed to secure preferential rates in freight costs. The care he showed throughout his career in selecting facility locations was clearly visible in these early period choices. Before long, other refineries began to be established along Kingsbury Run, the banks of the waterway, quickly filled with industrial facilities. Cleveland, with a population of approximately 44,000, was teeming with young and energetic people full of ambitions to rise. The petroleum refinery was seen as one of the rare opportunities offering the possibility of turning small capital into a great fortune. Moreover, establishing and operating a small refinery with a few workers was even less costly than opening a well-equipped shop. Sometimes capital as relatively modest as $1,000 could suffice. By mid-1863, 20 refineries had come into operation around Cleveland. Approximately 1/4 of the kerosene produced was being sent abroad. In the early years, profit margins were so high that many people, whether experienced or novice, could enter the market and earn gains. The market was not yet imposing a harsh discipline, and the ruthless elimination of competition had not yet made itself fully felt. Rockefeller would later recall this first period of prosperity with mild irony. In his view, those days were a harvest season in which bartenders, preachers, tailors, and people from every walk of life who were lucky enough to set up a petroleum distilling apparatus earned great gains. During the Civil War years, the range of uses for petroleum expanded rapidly. It was used to treat the wounds of Union soldiers and also served as a substitute for turpentine procured from the South. Even on battlefields, kerosene derived from crude petroleum became widespread. Ulysses S. Grant was known to often draft dispatch orders in his tent by the light of a flickering kerosene lamp. Over time, the paths of Rockefeller and Sam Andrews grew strained. When recounting the story of Standard Oil, Rockefeller tried to show Andrews as less important than he deserved. He belittled him by presenting him almost as an easily dispensable figure. Years later, Rockefeller would recall Samuel Andrews in these words: "In the early days, when it was difficult to find someone to purify oil, he was taken on as a poor workman who had nothing in his hands. He was too proud, possessed a stubborn English harshness, and had poor self-control. He was his own greatest enemy." However, this assessment had been made under the shadow of later disagreements. Initially, there was a warmer and more harmonious relationship between Andrews and Rockefeller. Andrews understood nothing of accounting or commercial affairs. In contrast, while Maurice Clark and Rockefeller managed the office, he was content to assume technical responsibility at the head of the refinery. Ida Tarbell, who challenged Rockefeller's harsh judgment, described Andrews differently. In her view, Andrews was a mechanical genius who improved the quality of kerosene and increased the yield obtained from each barrel of crude petroleum. In the early years, Rockefeller was not an inaccessible office boss withdrawn behind a giant structure he would one day build. On the contrary, he was directly involved in the refinery's day-to-day operations. One could see him at Kingsbury Run at 6:30 in the morning, sometimes rolling barrels, sometimes stacking pulleys, or carrying sawdust in the carpentry shop. This manner was a reflection of the habit of thrift and Puritan discipline he had received from his mother. After the refining process, sulfuric acid residues remained. Rockefeller did not see this as simple waste. He made plans to convert it into fertilizer. This approach was the first step of many ventures based on producing byproducts from waste, which would prove extremely profitable in the future. Rockefeller, who had passed through a turbulent childhood, aimed to be self-sufficient both in his life and in his business. His response to the persistent barrel shortage was also a product of this understanding. Rather than remaining dependent on others, he decided to produce his own barrels. A suspicious line item he saw on an invoice from a plumber made Rockefeller uncomfortable. He accordingly told Sam Andrews, "Let us hire a plumber on a monthly salary. Let us purchase our own pipes, fittings, and all plumbing materials." The refinery was taking responsibility not only for production, but also for its own transport and loading operations. Rockefeller's business philosophy rested on the pursuit of improvement in even the smallest detail. He constantly researched ways to increase efficiency, and before long refining had surpassed production to become the most profitable area of the business. Despite the harsh fluctuations, sudden booms, and collapses of the petroleum sector, he did not close a single year at a loss. Having initially approached the refinery business with caution, Rockefeller very soon realized that this was the great and bold opportunity he had been looking for and turned all his energy toward this field. Rockefeller was not someone who approached any business with half a step. He immersed himself completely in the refinery business, and this intensity was soon reflected in his home life as well. During the days when he shared a room with his brother William, there were times when he would poke him awake in the middle of the night. "A plan has come to mind," he would say excitedly. "What do you think?" Sleepy Will's answer was generally the same. "Leave this for the morning. I need sleep." But for John, waiting for morning was difficult. Even before sunrise, he would meet Maurice Clark and Sam Andrews on Cheshire Street and plunge into endless conversations about petroleum. In his world, this was nearly the only topic of discussion. According to his sister Mary Ann's account, even older businessmen would show him an instinctive respect. "They seemed not to want to make a move without him," she said. Even while John was having breakfast, they would come into the dining room and talk with him. However, not everyone shared this endless petroleum excitement. For some, this passion was overshadowing the bloody reality of the Civil War. There were those who said, "I am weary of this." If only they would talk about something else morning and evening. Rockefeller, meanwhile, had thrown himself into petroleum with an enthusiasm resembling his attachment to the Baptist Church. He approached his refinery with the care he had once shown sweeping the chapel floor. This similarity did not escape the notice of those around him either. In Maurice Clark's words, there were two things in which John held unshakable faith: the Baptist denomination and petroleum. Rockefeller, who was both excessively serious for his age and astonishingly youthful in spirit, took an almost childlike pleasure in doing business. When he won a major contract, his step would quicken. He would call out with enthusiasm or express his joy with a small, playful gesture. One of his early period work companions describes one of the rare moments when he saw Rockefeller truly exuberant. News had come from the Upper Valley. His buyer had secured a large petroleum shipment at a price far below the market rate. John suddenly leapt from his chair, says the witness. He cried out with joy, walked up and down the room, hugged me, threw his hat into the air. He was so carried away that I never forgot that moment. Such outbursts were exceptions, and in fact made his day-to-day measured composure all the more pronounced. Rockefeller's coming to dominate the petroleum sector so thoroughly was born from the tension between his obsession with order and an industry that was still in its infancy, disorderly and uncontrolled. In the exaggerated accounts of his rivals and enemies, Rockefeller was depicted as a dark figure appearing everywhere in the oil regions. The Oil Creek corridor encompassing Titusville, Oil City, and Franklin, immediately after Drake's discovery. According to a legend recounted by some early biographers, in 1860 Rockefeller went to Titusville representing a group of capitalists in Cleveland, and, citing the unpredictability of the oil flow, warned them against entering this business. However, Rockefeller's own statement was different. When I set out on the trip, I was already in the business. I made the journey in order to procure petroleum for my refinery. To reach the destination, it was necessary to travel first by railroad, then through dark forests and tree-covered hills by a stagecoach running along Oil Creek. How isolated the region was could be understood from the fact that news of the fall of Fort Sumter reached here only 4 days later. Despite this, the influx of adventurers was so intense that train cars were packed to bursting, and latecomers were forced to climb onto the roof. This was not a suitable place for the gentle-natured. To reach the railroad, petroleum barrels had to be transported over more than 20 miles of rough rural terrain. This work was done by thousands of teamsters demanding high wages, rough-bearded, loose-hatted, ready to fight and curse. The Pennsylvania barrel held a capacity of 42 gallons, and this measure gradually became the permanent standard of the industry. The same unit is still used today. Wagons loaded with petroleum would sometimes stretch like endless caravans on roads full of potholes. Due to road conditions, many barrels would topple over and shatter. Steep slopes became extremely dangerous. During rainy periods, the mud would reach an almost impassable density. When wagons became mired, 2 horses were often hitched together to pull them free. Horses were beaten mercilessly with thick black whips as they were forced to drag heavy loads through the black mud. Those that gave out were abandoned by the roadside, and as the corrosive chemicals of petroleum gnawed at their hides and hair, the landscape filled with rotting and horrifying carcasses. Transportation by waterway was no safer or cleaner than overland. Oil Creek connected to the Allegheny River. Hundreds of flatboats and steamers carried petroleum cargoes downstream. Sometimes barrels were loaded onto barges, then water stored behind floodgates would be suddenly released all at once to create an artificial freshwater flood, and the cargo would be swept downstream toward Pittsburgh. In Rockefeller's own words, the barges would capsize, barrels would collide and shatter in the chaos, and large quantities of petroleum would be lost. Indeed, in 1863, the Allegheny River, contaminated with petroleum seepages, caught fire and caused a bridge in Franklin to burn. Walking along the banks, Rockefeller witnessed the unsettling landscape left behind by the petroleum boom. The valley that had once been pastoral was now filled with derricks and tanks, darkened with engine houses and ramshackle shacks. Everything was crowded and disorderly, heaped together like a frantic patchwork. The boom towns established in the petroleum regions would rise suddenly, play host to a brief frenzy, and disappear just as quickly. When Rockefeller looked at this picture, he thought the sector had a disorderly and scattershot character. Years later, he would recall that period as follows. In the early days, this business was like a gold rush. Some of the first adventurers who arrived earned great fortunes, but everything was run in a chaotic manner. Rockefeller represented the second stage of capitalism as described by sociologist Max Weber. The place of the speculators who distinguished themselves with colorful displays of bravado was beginning to be taken by people raised in life's harsh discipline. calculated but bold when necessary, measured and reliable, cunning but wholly devoted to their work, adhering strictly to bourgeois principles. Rockefeller, too, became one of the symbols of this more rational, more systematic era. When Rockefeller arrived in the oil regions, petroleum no longer appeared to be a passing whim. In September 1861, two Cleveland entrepreneurs drilled the Empire well. This first great well, which according to one witness gushed higher than church steeples, produced approximately 3,000 barrels of petroleum per day. This spectacle had an almost supernatural effect on those who witnessed it. The Empire well flowed so rapidly that its owners had difficulty finding enough barrels to transport it. People were running to collect the black gold with ladles, cups, glasses, and buckets. Sudden abundance turned the market upside down. The price of petroleum fell to as low as 10 cents per barrel. Meanwhile, teamsters continued to demand $3 or $4 per barrel to transport the product to the railroad. From its very first years, the petroleum sector began swinging between two extremes. At times, production increased to such a degree that prices fell below costs. At other times, shortages arose. Prices rose rapidly, and fear of resource depletion spread. There are many accounts of Rockefeller's first visit to the petroleum fields. A recollection relayed by Titusville producer Franklin Breed offers a particularly vivid picture. Breed and Rockefeller had traveled on horseback through the valley to reach the wells, covering the final half-mile on foot. According to what Breed later wrote, they had to cross a pit 5 or 6 feet wide and approximately 4 feet deep on the way. This pit was full of the sediment removed from the bottoms of tanks. The mud had mixed with petroleum residue and taken on a dark, sticky, tar-like appearance. Spanning that sticky pit was only a 6-inch wide log. Breed was accustomed to this. He said he could walk across easily. Rockefeller first stated that it was impossible. He tried anyway, and slipped and fell. When he got to his feet, he smiled at Breed and said, "Well, Breed, you have gotten me into the oil business from head to toe." While speaking with the rough and coarse-mannered oil prospectors, Rockefeller may have appeared cold and aloof from the outside. Despite this, he expressed that he enjoyed their conversation. He described these people as cheerful, good-natured individuals who took their troubles lightly, of the kind one comes across in mining regions. A slight condescension can be sensed in these words, but they were not entirely dismissive. Rockefeller was an attentive listener. He carefully recorded what people told him, and by repeating the information he heard many times over, he lodged it in his memory. For him, knowledge was capital to be processed until it had been memorized and digested. There was a marked humility in Rockefeller's insistence on learning. In his own words, "It is extremely important to remember what others tell you. Remembering what you already know is not as important." What drove him to act was, of course, the prospect of gain, but he felt a serious discomfort in the face of the loose moral order prevailing in the region. This place where gamblers and prostitutes roamed freely was already being referred to in those early days as Sodom drunk. The roughness and raucousness of the oil prospectors was the stuff of legend. In the words of one visitor, throughout the region one could hear the slapping sounds of playing cards on whiskey-stained tables in taverns. Another observer had witnessed the general debauchery with astonishment and wrote that the excesses in Petroleum Center at times surpassed even Monte Carlo and the Latin Quarter of Paris. For Rockefeller, a pious and measured Christian, this crude male world intertwined with immorality must have seemed almost hellish. Petroleum workers walked around in muddy high boots, leaving black tracks in the brothels, taverns, and gambling dens of Titusville and Oil City. Many of the newly rich displayed their wealth ostentatiously, wearing silk top hats, diamond pins, and gold watch chains. They paraded their excesses before all eyes. It is notable that in the travel notes of the period, hellish comparisons were frequently drawn upon to describe the atmosphere. Rockefeller's visits to the oil regions in all likelihood positioned him, in his own eyes, as someone defending virtue in a godless environment. As a passionate advocate of temperance, he felt uncomfortable being among drunk crowds. Perhaps this is why he preferred not to make frequent trips to the petroleum fields. Two accounts of uncertain origin reflect the contempt Rockefeller felt toward the loose morality spreading among some producers. According to one of these stories, in Roosevelt one night, a local vigilance committee silently approached a flatboat tied to the shore. The boat was packed with women of loose character and whiskey sellers. When the entertainment reached its height, the committee untied the ropes and set the boat adrift on the current, sweeping those aboard 20 miles downstream. According to the account, Rockefeller had fully approved of this intervention.